So thank you. And thank you all for coming. And I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to share our research with you. The paper I will discuss with you was actually sponsored by the IAA. I'm also particularly grateful for that. The title of the paper is Challenging the Conventional Wisdom on Active Management. And so what I'm going to do in the 12 minutes I have is first describe this conventional wisdom, and then go through the 3 points of this conventional wisdom one by one, and share with you what our conclusions are after reading over 300 different academic papers published over the last 20 years. So the three of us, this is joint work with Jon Fulkerson from the University of Dayton and Tim Riley from Arkansas. The three of us read collectively over 300 papers so that you do not have to. So we have a new survey of these over 300 different papers, and we had a kind of an impossible task to summarize that in 20 pages. And now as a professor, I have to try to summarize this to you in 12 minutes. Well, normally as a professor, I generally give talks of 90 minutes, so bear with me. What we did is we started with one of the most seminal papers in the literature on active management, which is Mark Carhart's 1997 paper. And his conclusions for us are the starting point for the conventional wisdom. And then we look at the 3 main points that he made. Our goal of our paper is to evaluate what is still true. To what extent does that conventional wisdom from 1997 still hold? Because a lot, of course, has happened in the last 20 years. So in our paper, we go into some of the things that have happened. Right? Many, many changes in the investment management industry, its size, its complexity. And so we go a bit in detail there, which I don't have time for today. Our point is to look for support for or against the conventional wisdom. Our conclusion is that the recent academic literature really challenges this conventional wisdom. That in general, we think the academic literature in the last 20 years has become much more positive about active management than the academic literature as of 1997. So here's the conventional wisdom. So Mark Carhart's 1997 paper, he concluded that in 1997, using his methodology and his data, that data did not support the existence of skilled or informed mutual fund portfolio managers. He wrote this paper in a fairly strong language and somewhat unconditional. So now it depends, not too much hedging. Okay? This is a seminal article with over 13,000 different citations. So for an academic finance paper, this is in the stratosphere. Okay? So this is a very seminal paper, which we argue, together with other papers, many of which we cite in our study, has created this conventional wisdom. That's 3 parts. First, the average fund underperforms after taking into account all costs. Second, yes, some funds outperform, but that outperformance does not persist. So the funds that end up outperforming are different every year, and so it's very difficult to predict which funds are going to end up outperforming in the future. Third, yes, some managers are skilled, but the skilled managers generally are more expensive. So after costs, right, the end investors do not benefit from that skill. Next, I'm going to go through these 3 conclusions and see what the academic literature in the last 20 years has to say about this. First, the average fund underperforms. The support for this is largely the sharp argument about the arithmetic of active management, thinking about active management as a zero-sum game. This is also driven by a certain static perspective on investing, and the market portfolio being the same for everyone and not changing over time. At the same time, there's a lot of empirical support for this. A lot of papers actually do show, even in the last 20 years, that on average, actively managed mutual funds do not strongly outperform over the long term. So this is the one conclusion where we say there's actually strong evidence for that for the average fund. Second, the performance of the best funds does not persist. The main support is the Carhart paper. Okay. Then third, some fund managers are scaled, but few have scale in excess of costs. There are various papers before 97 that document this. A very prominent, more recent paper is by Fama and French in 2010, where they also find this. As a result of this conventional wisdom, we've seen major changes, we think, in the market. A major shift away from actively managed to passive. So in 97, which we take as our starting point of our survey, about 8% of assets in the US mutual fund world was invested in passive products. At the end of our survey, 2017, that's about 40%. There's some literature that challenges this notion that the average fund underperforms. Most of these papers challenging this make a methodological point. Is that the methodology that is used in these studies to conclude this make a bunch of assumptions or use a certain methodology that biases you against finding outperformance. Okay. This is a somewhat technical discussion. We give some of the details in our paper, and I don't have time for those details right now. But the methodology really matters. Data really matters. Time periods really matter. If you relax some of these assumptions, if you look at more sophisticated statistical techniques, if you look more about what's actually accessible in terms of benchmark performance, in terms of tradable portfolios, what are you comparing actively managed portfolios with? You become a lot less confident that the average fund underperforms. Second, there's no performance persistence of the very best funds. This is a result that I think has been clearly been challenged by the more recent literature. There's a bunch of papers that find strong evidence for performance persistence challenging Mark Carhart. Some of that is taking into account, again, of better methodology, better data, also higher frequency data. And a good example is the Bolin and Bussey paper 2005. That the 10 to 20% of top performers, they seem to have really the ability to perform more persistently over time. Then three, some fund managers are scaled, but few have scale after taking into account all costs. Here, there are many papers that also challenge this. One of those is by myself with Ante Peter-Justo in 2009, where we introduced a measure of active shear, which is a basic statistical tool that compares the holdings of a fund to the holdings of the fund's benchmark. The point that we make is that many funds that say that they're very active may not be that different from their benchmark. So they don't have a high active share. Among the high active share funds, there's actually strong evidence, we argue, that there's no underperformance, perhaps even outperformance. Among the low active share funds that are not cheap, there's very strong evidence that investors do not benefit after costs. So even though this may be to some extent true on average, there's various ways in which you ex ante can identify funds that have a much better chance on average to outperform or underperform. In our paper, we give other examples other than active share of how to distinguish among funds. So how do active managers then create value? There's some obvious ways by selecting stocks that outperform, or very importantly too, by timing the market. There's a whole bunch of papers that show that actively managed funds tend to do better in down markets or during recessions. Less obvious ways are through voting or by text, by creating portfolios that are very tax efficient. The conventional wisdom also has other limitations. Most of the research that gives rise to the conventional wisdom is based on research only looking at US equity mutual funds. Now, arguably, that may be the least persuasive market to consider the power of active management, because the US equity markets are dominated by large caps that are arguably in a very efficient, very competitive market. Once you go outside US large caps, you go to small caps, you go to bond funds, you go to hybrid funds, international funds, emerging markets, hedge funds. Arguably, those environments may be more promising maybe better opportunities for active management. And there's significant literature that suggests this. At the same time, the limit is that there's simply not that many papers because most papers, again, focus on US equities. There are also real research obstacles in evaluating. One is that academics, we disagree a lot. And we haven't been able to have a consensus model for performance evaluation. So many different papers will do their own thing. And I'm one of those people who also disagrees with the standard method. I think the Farmer-French model, the way they do performance evaluation, I have a lot of issues with. But at the same time, because there's so many different ways of evaluating performance, and there's really no consensus among academics how to do this, this makes drawing conclusions as academics very, very difficult. I also want to acknowledge that as an academic, it's very difficult for me to understand the process that gives rise to actively managed portfolios. The whole investment process that leads to whatever we're studying and how much we see of that is very limited. There's many things that managers are doing or ways in which they may contribute value to their clients that we simply don't see. So we need much more data. We need a much better understanding. In our paper, we give some directions to academics of other things to study that we haven't even started to study. So to conclude, we find over the last 20 years of over 300 academic papers, and I think we end up citing close to 300 published papers, that active managers have a variety of skills, and we find a lot of evidence that they create value for their clients, that after cost, many of them actually do generate positive value for investors, and therefore that active management is much more promising than if you believe the conventional wisdom.